by our military with what can only be described as UFOs doing impossible things. So that was one thing. Now the other threat to secrecy was, as I mentioned earlier in this interview, the leaks that began to occur from the inside to various researchers, leaks dealing with crash retrievals of UFOs, most famously Roswell. When Stanton Friedman, for example, was down in Louisiana, met up with Jesse Marcel Sr., almost by accident, by chance, that came out. But there were many other stories, too. Many of them were leaked to the researcher Leonard Stringfield, who at that time collected a large number of insider testimony, sort of like the earliest whistleblower-type testimony that we now hear a lot about these days. But back then, it was a new thing. So you've got these two prongs of attack, so to speak, on the old secrecy. If you're one of the secret keepers, or if you're in the intelligence community, maybe monitoring this problem, this could be difficult. So what do you do about it? Well, there is evidence showing, in my view, that starting in the late 70s, early 80s in particular, initiatives went out to disable those Freedom of Information Act documents and the crash retrieval leaks. I think this is possible. Are the MJ-12 documents such an attempt to do this? It's a hard question for me to answer because I think there's a lot of evidence showing that those MJ-12 documents have validity to them. After all, there is data in those documents that seems to be very accurate. That's very arcane. For example, the mentioning of Donald Menzel in the Majestic 12 documents seemed almost like a joke to researchers originally, because Menzel was such a hardcore debunker for years and years. It caused researcher Stanton Friedman to go to the Menzel archives at Harvard University, and what Stanton there found was that Menzel had lived a double life, and he had a very high level of clearance within the intelligence community, was an expert cryptographer, and was top-level connected into NSA and so on. And so that Menzel would have been a very good person to be on the MJ-12 committee. There was a lot of other arcane knowledge about those documents in terms of the dates that were listed in there that give one pause before you just throw them as hoaxes.
Suggesting that at a minimum somebody on the inside created these documents, if in fact that they're just disinformation.
Well, what I think may happen is that these documents were leaked. Some of them are legitimate. Some could be hoaxes. Since the original documents leaked out, there's an enormous amount that have come out. And some appear to be hoaxes. Some appear to be legitimate, in my opinion. But if you've got these legitimate documents and you leak them in such a manner that they are disputed, that's like getting an inoculation for a disease that your body then learns to reject. In other words, you package the truth in such a way that it becomes not believable. And I think that the leaked documents in this manner fit that bill. There's another thing the intelligence community did that is very clearly, I think, disinformation at this time, and that's its relationship with the National Enquirer. The National Enquirer, I look at straightforward as a CIA publication through and through. It was run by a man named Gene Pope for many years. Now, Gene Pope was CIA. He was also actually came out of the world of organized crime, but he went with CIA in the 1950s and then founded the Enquirer. What did he do with this publication? The Enquirer in the 1960s and 70s and through the 80s published some very legitimate UFO stories. This was the thing. It's fascinating. Bob Pratt was the journalist. He did a lot of good work there. Yeah. The problem was there were some very demonstrably false articles on UFOs in the Enquirer at the same time. And then, of course, packaged in such a sensationalist tabloid that nobody in the academic or scientific world would ever look at the Enquirer. A lot of true information came out in the Enquirer that also that the scientific community was inoculated against. The 1975 airspace violations, for example, were first revealed in the National Enquirer. They were all true.
Yeah.
But because they were in the Enquirer, no one followed up. No one followed up. And this is how I'm looking at the leaked documents. Those MJ-12 documents in the early 80s came out through certainly what appears to be Kirtland Air Force Base. And Special Agent Richard Dolan of the Air Force seems to be very closely connected with these documents. And all of this seems to be part of an intelligence operation, the full story of which we still do not know because they're not talking. But we do know that a year and a half before the MJ-12 documents were shown, were sent anonymously to some researchers, that Richard Dolan showed researcher Linda Moulton Howe documents that were very, very similar to the MJ-12 documents, but also kind of different. The MJ-12 documents in late 84 did not discuss a crash in Aztec, New Mexico. They only mentioned Roswell and then another crash in Texas. Whereas these other documents shown to Linda Howe did describe not just the Roswell crash, but also this crash in Aztec, New Mexico. Why the discrepancy? Why? Well, could it be that some of these documents were not exactly true and others were true?
Is disinformation sort of one of the focuses of the second volume of your book?
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. I dealt also with, the famous case, the Paul Benowitz case, where Paul Benowitz was a private defense contractor, scientist, who lived right outside Kirtland Air Force Base, outside Manzano weapons range there. And in the late 70s, early 80s, was seeing some very bizarre activity over that range. Now, it has been argued by some researchers that what he was seeing was fairly conventional, exotic, yes, but cutting-edge but conventional types of U.S. weapons being tested there. And the argument had been made by others that all the UFO stories were fed to Benowitz, the rumors about a base at Dulce, New Mexico, and all of this was supposedly fed to him to take him off the path of what was actually going on. I don't believe that. What I believe happened is that, yes, Benowitz was messed with by the intelligence community. Absolutely he was. Because he was seeing genuine UFO anomalous activity over by that base, and he had to be dealt with. And I will make that argument. I have made that argument. When the book comes out, you'll be able to read about it.
Rick Doty, by the way, had his involvement in the Benowitz story, and of course, Benowitz, it was kind of a tragic story. He sort of went around the bend. He went.
It was very sad. And
I should point out to our listeners that I have invited Rick Doty to appear on this program a couple of times. He's agreed to do it, and we're just waiting for the right date.
Oh, I think that's great. He's a very interesting man. I've had some correspondence with him myself, and there are people who look at Rick Doty as this evil guy because he's messed with the UFO field. I don't really know how I feel about all of that. I mean, this is a man who's doing his job. Okay, the first thing you've got to say is that he was in the military and he did his job. And whatever you think about that job, whether you think it was right or wrong, I think one has to recognize that he wasn't acting as some lone guy out there. He was doing something that he was supposed to be doing, that his supervisors wanted him to do.
Yeah, which makes you wonder who the bosses were and what the marching orders were.
Yeah, we have to keep this all in mind, and I don't fault individuals in the intelligence community who are doing their job. Everyone's got to make a living, okay? but also there are people like ourselves who want to research this and figure out what's happening, and we also have a right to find out too.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I want to talk to Richard Dolan about Area 51, Bob Lazar, Phil Corso, and a heck of a lot more. Stay with us on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with Richard Dolan, author of UFOs and the National Security State, about UFOs, cover-ups, disinformation, things of that sort. We know that scientists in general, mainstream scientists, don't want to touch this topic with a 10-foot photon torpedo because of what it might do to their careers. I wonder if the same is true for historians. Richard Dolan is an historian, and I wonder if he's paid a price for coming out so strongly on this very strange and interesting topic. We'll get into that as soon as we come back on Coast to Coast AM. Thanks for staying with us here on Coast to Coast AM. Our guest is Richard Dolan. We're covering the gamut of UFO cover-up and secrecy topics, including disinformation. Richard, I want to ask you the question that I alluded to in that tease during the break there about what this has done to your career. Now, can you write about this stuff? Although